students. Today we are going to discuss upon the topic Renaissance in literature, Renaissance in specifically English literature. I am Dr. Papari Kalita, Assistant Professor in English, Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, Assam Downtown University. Now let us look into have a brief knowledge of what Renaissance in literature actually is. The term Renaissance means rebirth. The movement had its origin in Italy and it gradually spread throughout Europe. The movement had significant influence over the English literature. After the end of the War of the Roses, 1453 to 87, Tudor dynasty came to power in England. Henry VIII was the ruler of English from 1509 to 1547. He desired to annul his first marriage as he had no heir from his wife. However, polygamy was prohibited under the rule of the Catholic Church. Thus, he fell into conflict with the church. He was even excommunicated by the church, but he did not pay heed to it. To fulfill his desire, he, for the first time in the history of England, ended the rule of the Catholic Church and established himself as both the head of the state as well as the church. So, this is the background of how the Renaissance began. This step of his influenced every aspect of English, including life, culture, literature, thoughts, etc. from that time onwards. So, the seeds of Renaissance has been shown by King Henry. So now we let us try to understand. And Renaissance always emphasized on classical scholarship and the values that we have received from the classical masters of ancient Greece and Rome. And towards the one of the major things that England had seen that England had going for it in the late 15th century was the introduction of the printing press. The printing press actually revolutionized the entire idea of Renaissance because it made earlier the books were handwritten, but with the invention of the printing press, this the books came to be published and disseminated among a larger audience. A literary culture started to develop gradually. So, in the Renaissance age, it was the reason instead of the religion that governed human behavior. The man was free to make the use of his power. Now, reason dominated all the spheres of life that decreased the influence of religion on the people. Most of the blind faiths and practices were given up. People gradually started reading books more and more. The reading culture came with the availability of books being printed in the printing press. And Renaissance always promoted the rediscovery of classical philosophy, literature, and art. And in that, by through the printing press and by rediscovering the merits of the classical philosophy, literature, and art, Renaissance bridged the gap between the Middle Ages and the modern day civilization. And that is why the Renaissance is considered to be the early modern period. So, the Renaissance in literature. It believed in the divine rights of the kings to rule, and it, it is mentioned center. Earlier, religion was the center of interest. Hence, the main concern of literature was to deal with the religion directly or indirectly. So, mostly in medieval times, we find that literature dealt with religious themes and symbols and characters. But with the coming of Renaissance, literature came to be came to deal with men and the daily life of men and the and humanism mostly. In the Renaissance, the focus shifted from religion to men, and men became the center of interest. And although the Renaissance arrived in England in the mid 1500s, almost 2 centuries after it began some of its greatest achievements occurred on these shores, particularly in literature. So there are some very renowned poets who wrote poetry during the period of Renaissance. They are Sir Thomas Wyatt, Sir Philip Sidney, and Edmund Spenser transformed Italian forms into richly flexible English verse. They actually practiced and transformed the sonnet form in. So we have Spenserian stanzas. The way in which poetry was written was also transformed to a great extent. And now we come on to how it developed. There was development in science as well. The age was accompanied by the birth of modern science, mathematics, astronomy, etc. In the fourth decade of the 16th century, Copernicus replaced Aristotle's system with the sun instead of the earth at the center of the universe. So uh, there in Renaissance we have come to know that classical scholarship was held high, and classical scholarship was held high, and the literature, culture, and history of the classical times came to be celebrated, and the writers also practice those in their writings. Drama is another form that came to be very popular during the time of Renaissance with the dramatists like Shakespeare, Marlowe, Spencer, Johnson. They have written some incomparable drama during that time, and these names that I have taken uh, are very remarkable when we speak about the Renaissance period. So Renaissance, the circumstances that made the uh, assimilation of the European, the Middle Ages, the literature of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance period, that actually was possible. Circumstances that that made the assimilation possible were already disintegrating and calling into question the newly won certainties as well as the older truths that were dislodging. So, in this period, England's population doubled, prices rocketed, rents followed, old social loyalties dissolved, and new industrial, agricultural, and commercial base were first tapped. Real wages hit an all-time low in the 1620s, and social relations were plunged into a state of fluidity from the from which the merchant and the ambitious lesser gentleman profited at the expense of the aristocrat and the laborer, as satires and comedies current from the 1590s complain. Behind the Elizabethan vogue for pastoral poetry lies the fact of the prosperity of the enclothing sheep farmer who sought to increase pasture at the expense of the peasantry. So there was a change in almost all the ways, all the stages of life, all the areas of life when the Renaissance came, and after the Renaissance reached Italy from in England, new ideas developed, and there are many artists who have expressed the changes through their art, and the Renaissance movement developed more and more. It developed more in the 16th century, and and what Samuel Johnson has said in regard to Renaissance is that the term Renaissance was first prominently used by the French historian Jules Michelet, and 2 years later, Jacob Burckhardt immortalized the term in the publication of his The Civilization of the Renaissance, in which the period was viewed as the beginning of the modern age. As I have mentioned earlier, Renaissance is considered to be the beginning of the modern age because it has shifted. Earlier, the literature of the Middle Ages, earlier till Renaissance came, earlier it was considered to the literature was considered to be written for the sake of religion. So So the characters, themes, symbols, everything was based on the religious matters. But Renaissance, as it implies rebirth, it shifted the focus from religion to man. So humanism came to be more exercised by the writers, and focus on men, the way of life of men became the center of the Renaissance period. The English Renaissance was a cultural and artistic movement in England dating from the late 15th to the early 17th century. So it is a movement that dated from 15th to the late 15th to the early 17th century. And the English Renaissance is different from the Italian Renaissance in several ways. The Renaissance that was there in English in England was different from that of Italy. Dominant art forms of the English Renaissance were literature and music. The difference is that the dominant forms are, of the English Renaissance were literature and music. Visual arts in the English Renaissance were much less. So visual art was much less, but significant, much less significant than in the Italian Renaissance. The English period began far later than the Italian, which is usually considered to begin in the late 14th century and was moving into mannerism and the Baroque by the 1550s or earlier. In contrast, the English Renaissance can only be said to begin shakily in the 1520s and continued until perhaps 1620. So, this is what Renaissance is briefly. We will discuss further in our class. Thank you.